My name is Charmaine Scott. I am 29 years old. Last Thanksgiving, I stood in my parents' kitchen and discovered they had drained my $150,000 life savings to pay for my younger sister's winter wonderland wedding. They took 7 years of my grueling night shifts as a neonatal nurse and handed it to a wedding planner. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not shed a single tear. I stepped out into the freezing snow, called my 80-year-old grandfather, and listened as he made one phone call that turned my father's privileged life into a legal nightmare. Before I take you back to that freezing November evening, take a second to like and subscribe to Sister Revenge. Drop a comment telling me your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now. It was a Thursday in Columbus, Ohio. The kind of bitter winter night where the wind howls through the bare trees and ice coats the driveway. Inside my parents' suburban mansion, the air felt thick with the smell of roasted turkey sage and expensive perfume. 40 extended relatives crowded around the long mahogany dining table. I stood alone in the kitchen, leaning my hip against the cool granite island. I needed a quiet moment away from the forced smiles and the endless questions about why I was still single. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened my email. A contractor had just sent over an invoice for $10,000. It was the final deposit required to start the kitchen remodel on my new downtown condo. I spent the last 7 years working double shifts at the hospital, denying myself vacations and ignoring my fatigue just to build a safety net. That condo was my ticket out of my family's shadow. I opened my banking app to wire the funds. The screen showed a small blue circle spinning as the data loaded. From the dining room, the sharp chime of silver striking crystal echoed over the chatter. My father, Richard, stood at the head of the table, holding up a flute of champagne. The room fell silent. He looked down at my younger sister, Savannah, and the man sitting next to her. Chase Sterling wore a tailored suit and a practiced smile. He was a finance guy who always seemed to steer conversations toward his offshore investments. My father puffed out his chest, soaking in the attention of his siblings and country club neighbors. He announced that he and my mother, Brenda, had a special surprise. He projected his voice so the entire house could hear. He told the room they were fully funding Savannah's dream wedding. A $150,000 winter spectacle to properly welcome Chase into the Harris family. The guests erupted into applause. Savannah covered her mouth, feigning shock as the diamond on her left hand caught the chandelier light. Brenda dabbed the corner of her eye with a linen napkin, playing the role of the proud, emotional matriarch. In the kitchen, the blue circle on my phone stopped spinning. The numbers populated the screen. Available balance, $12.50. I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to lead. I tapped the refresh icon. The screen flashed and reloaded. $12.50. My thumb moved to the transaction history tab. A single outbound wire transfer sat at the top of the list, initiated 48 hours ago. The recipient was Sterling Event Planning. The authorized signer was Richard Harris. The account was a legacy custodial setup we opened when I was a teenager, depositing my first paychecks. As I grew older and my nursing salary accumulated, I never thought to remove his name. I trusted the man who raised me. The bank treated him as an equal joint owner. He simply walked in, signed a slip, and handed my future to my sister. Through the archway, I watched my father sip his champagne. He looked entirely unbothered. He knew I was in the kitchen. He knew I would check my phone eventually. He just assumed I would keep my mouth shut to avoid ruining the holiday. He expected me to be the quiet, obedient scapegoat I had always been. Years of triaging premature infants had trained me to slow my heart rate when the monitors flatlined. This was just another code blue. My chest ached, but my hands did not shake. I locked my phone and slid it deep into my coat pocket. I turned away from the warmth of the kitchen, pushing open the back door and stepping out onto the icy patio. The snow bit into my cheeks. The cold Ohio wind whipped my hair across my face. My parents had not just stolen my money, they had stolen my independence to buy social status. I pulled my phone back out, bringing up my father's contact information. I typed a brief text message telling him to step out onto the back porch. I hit send. It was time to find out how a man reacts when his quiet daughter refuses to play her part. The frigid Ohio wind whipped across the wraparound porch, cutting through the thin fabric of my scrub jacket. I stood near the edge of the frozen wooden planks, staring at the heavy oak door. Inside, the warmth of the dining room glowed through the frosted glass panes. Laughter echoed over the faint hum of jazz music. I kept my phone clutched in my hand. The text message had been delivered 2 minutes ago. The brass handle turned with a heavy clack. The door swung open, spilling a rectangle of yellow light onto the snow-dusted floorboards. My father stepped out first. He still held his crystal champagne flute, his posture relaxed and expansive. My mother followed close behind, wrapping a cashmere shawl around her shoulders to block the sudden draft. They wore expressions of mild irritation, as if I had interrupted a crucial business negotiation rather than a family dinner. Richard took a sip of his drink. He looked at me with a lazy sort of expectation, waiting for me to speak. He did not look like a man who had just committed grand larceny. He looked like a patriarch annoyed by a disobedient child. I did not offer a greeting. I raised my right hand and turned the screen of my phone toward them. The brightness illuminated the dark porch. The blue banking app interface displayed the $12.50 balance. I waited for the shock. I waited for my mother to gasp, or for my father to stammer an excuse about identity theft or bank errors. I watched their eyes track across the digital numbers. Richard did not flinch. His breathing remained steady. The champagne in his glass did not even ripple. He stared at the screen for a brief second before shifting his gaze back to my face. A cold, nauseating realization washed over me. He already knew the balance. The lack of surprise was the most terrifying confession he could have offered. Premeditation looks exactly like boredom. "Where is my money?" I asked. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. It was low and stripped of all inflection. Richard let out a soft, practiced sigh. He leaned his shoulder against the cedar siding of the house. He adopted the calm, measured tone he used when explaining simple concepts to difficult clients. "Let us not be dramatic, Aurora," he said. "You are talking about idle resources. Savannah is marrying Chase Sterling. The Sterlings are legacy wealth in this city. A proper wedding is not a party. It is a strategic societal merger. We are securing the future of the Harris name. I needed liquid capital to guarantee the Sterling family feels appropriately welcomed." I stared at him, trying to process the sheer audacity of his logic. He was justifying the theft of my life savings as a corporate investment. I spent the last 7 years working 60-hour weeks at the pediatric hospital. I missed birthdays, holidays, and vacations to build a safety net while Savannah dropped out of 3 different college programs and lived rent-free in their pool house. "You took $150,000, I said, keeping my feet planted firmly on the frozen wood. "That was the down payment for my home. You forged a withdrawal on a legacy account to buy ice sculptures and a designer dress." Brenda stepped forward, resting her manicured hand on my father's arm. She tilted her head, deploying the soft, patronizing smile she perfected over decades of country club luncheons. She wielded maternal guilt like a sharpened scalpel. "Sweetheart, you are not looking at the bigger picture," Brenda murmured. "You are a single nurse. You work long hours. You do not have a husband or a family to put in a massive downtown condo. What do you really need all that space for right now? Your sister is starting a dynasty. This is a family tax. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You should be honored to contribute to your sister's happiness." The phrase family tax echoed in the freezing air. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me and the man who raised me. The blindfold I had worn my entire life fell away. Their affection had never been unconditional. It was entirely transactional. I was not a daughter to them. I was a yielding battery, a financial reserve they could harvest whenever the golden child required more light. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch, waiting for my conditioned response. They expected the familiar pattern to play out. They expected me to cry. They expected me to argue until my throat grew raw and then eventually submit out of sheer emotional exhaustion. They built their entire dynamic on my willingness to keep the peace. The old Aurora would have broken down weeping in the snow, begging for scraps of their approval. The old Aurora would have walked back into that dining room and pasted on a smile to protect their public image. I felt the icy wind slip down my collar. I reached for the zipper of my wool coat and pulled it up to my chin. The metallic drag of the zipper sounded incredibly loud in the quiet night. I pocketed my phone. I did not shed a single tear. Crying requires a vulnerability they no longer deserve to witness. "You have 12 hours, I said. Richard raised an eyebrow. The corner of his mouth twitched into a smug smirk. "Excuse me," he replied. I looked him dead in the eye. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. "I want a cashier's check for the full amount by noon tomorrow. If the funds are not returned to a secure account under my sole name, I will stop asking politely." My father let out a genuine, sharp laugh. The sound drifted out into the snow-covered yard. He took another sip of his champagne, shaking his head in sheer amusement. "Or what, Aurora?" he chuckled. "You will call the police on your own parents. You will drag your sister's wedding through the mud. You do not have the stomach for a fight. You never have. Go back to your apartment, cool off. We will save you a slice of pie." He turned his back on me, opening the heavy oak door. The warm light and the sound of jazz music spilled out once more. Brenda gave me a final, pitying look before following him inside. The door clicked shut, plunging the porch back into darkness and silence. I turned around and walked down the wooden steps. My boots crunched over the layer of fresh snow covering the gravel driveway. I unlocked my old sedan and slipped into the driver's seat. The interior was freezing. I started the engine, listening to the heater rattle as it struggled to push warm air through the vents. I gripped the steering wheel. My knuckles turned white under the strain. The urge to scream clawed at the back of my throat, but I swallowed it down. Fighting them with emotion was exactly what they wanted. Emotion was messy. Emotion could be dismissed as female hysteria or bitter sibling jealousy. They held the home court advantage in the arena of social manipulation. To win this war, I could not fight like a wounded daughter. I had to fight systemically. I had to dismantle the very foundation of their arrogance. I shifted the car into reverse. The tires spun for a fraction of a second on the icy gravel before catching traction. I backed out of the long, sweeping driveway, leaving the glowing windows of the mansion behind. The dark suburban road stretched out ahead of me, lit only by the sweeping beams of my headlights. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and placed it in the cup holder. My father believed I was too weak to strike back. He believed I had no allies. He forgot about the one person who taught me how to read a ledger before I learned how to ride a bicycle. My accounts were empty, and I was driving alone through a blinding winter storm, but I was not defenseless. I reached toward the glowing screen scrolling past the hospital contacts and the local friends. I needed someone who operated outside the realm of polite suburban warfare. I needed the man who built an empire on cold, hard steel. The phone began to ring, connecting the call. I listened to the steady tone echoing through the speakers of my car. Who holds enough power to terrify an arrogant man who thinks he owns the world? The tires of my old sedan gripped the salted highway as I drove north toward my apartment. The rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers kept time with the steady ringing tone pulsing through my car speakers. While I waited for the line to connect, the dark road ahead blurred. My mind slipped backward, pulling a vivid memory from the dusty archives of my childhood. I was 10 years old, sitting in an oversized leather chair that seemed to swallow me whole. The chair sat inside a glass-walled office overlooking a sprawling manufacturing floor in Cleveland. The air inside the building smelled of machine oil, burning ozone, and dark roast coffee. My grandfather, Harrison Harris, stood by the large window, watching the heavy steel presses stamp out automotive parts on the floor below. He built his fortune from dirt and sweat, working brutal hours to forge an empire. He wore tailored suits now, but his hands remained rough and calloused. He walked over to his heavy oak desk, picked up a solid silver dollar, and pressed it into my small palm. His fingers felt like heavy grit sandpaper. He looked down at me with piercing, icy blue eyes. "Aurora," he said, his voice rumbling like the factory floor beneath us. "Never let anyone hold your purse strings. Not a boss, not a husband, and especially not your father. The men in this world will try to convince you that your safety belongs in their pockets. It is a lie. Control your own coin, and you control your own breath." The memory faded as a sharp click sounded through the car speakers. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Harrison was 80 years old, but age had not softened his edges. He sounded alert and awake despite the late hour. I kept my eyes on the icy road and gave him the facts. I did not soften the blow. I did not wrap the ugly truth in familial excuses. I told him about the $12.50 balance. I detailed the wire transfer to Sterling Event Planning. I described Richard standing on the back porch, holding a crystal champagne flute, justifying the theft as a necessary societal merger. Harrison did not interrupt. He listened to the entire clinical autopsy of my ruined savings account in heavy silence. I heard the faint clink of porcelain over the line. He was setting his coffee mug down on his desk. The quiet stretched for a long, tense moment. When he finally spoke, his tone carried the precise, frigid weight of an incoming blizzard. My grandfather despised Richard. He viewed my father as a soft, arrogant creature who inherited a comfortable life he never possessed the spine to actually earn. Harrison saw right through the country club memberships, the designer clothes, and the leased luxury cars. He used the old custodial loophole, Harrison murmured. The words were quiet, but laced with pure, unadulterated disgust. He treated your future like a slush fund to buy favor with a crypto bro. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, navigating a slippery curve. The banks are closed until Monday, I told him. It is Thanksgiving. The wire is already processing in the system. By the time the fraud department opens an investigation, Savannah will have already spent my money on imported floral arrangements and catering deposits. I heard the sound of a leather chair creaking as Harrison leaned forward. "You are thinking like a civilian, Aurora," he replied. "We do not call toll-free numbers and wait on hold for a retail customer service representative. We bypass the retail bank entirely." Harrison explained his strategy with the clinical detachment of a general ordering a tactical airstrike. He told me to hang up and wait for a conference call. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time, Harrison had merged another line. The new voice belonged to Elias Thorne. Elias was the senior partner at a boutique estate litigation firm in downtown Cleveland. He was the legal shark Harrison kept on a very expensive retainer to protect his manufacturing assets from predators. Elias did not waste time with polite pleasantries. He asked me to confirm the exact routing details and the registered name of the wedding planning agency. I recited the information straight from my banking app. Elias typed rapidly on a keyboard in the background. The lawyer outlined his countermeasure. He explained that filing a dispute with my local bank branch was useless because Richard possessed legal joint authority on paper. We did not need to freeze my empty account. We needed to freeze the destination. Elias drafted an emergency ex parte injunction while we stayed on the line. He targeted the wedding planner's commercial escrow accounts directly. He cited credible suspicion of fiduciary fraud and the unauthorized transfer of disputed custodial assets. Because Elias held an elite standing with the district judges, he could secure a signature from the duty magistrate before dawn. The injunction would drop a legal cage around the funds the moment the wire hit the planner's ledger. The money would be paralyzed. The planner could not touch it. Savannah could not spend it. Richard could not reclaim it. It was trapped in a financial purgatory until a judge untangled the mess. "Go to sleep, kid," Harrison said right before the call ended. "Let the wolves handle the hunting tonight." I pulled into my apartment complex just past midnight. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world buried under a thick, silent blanket of white. I walked into my small living room, unbuttoned my heavy coat, and kicked off my wet boots. I did not turn on the television. I did not look at the stack of bridal shower invitations sitting on my kitchen counter. I took a hot shower, letting the steam thaw the chill from my bones. I crawled into bed and closed my eyes. For the first time in 7 years, I slept without worrying about my next hospital shift. The morning sun broke through the horizontal blinds, casting sharp, bright lines across my bedroom wall. It was Friday, Black Friday, the biggest retail shopping day of the entire year. I sat at my small dining table holding a warm mug of chamomile tea. The apartment felt quiet and deeply peaceful. Then the screen of my phone lit up, illuminating the wooden table. A notification appeared. One new voicemail from Richard Harris. I took a slow sip of the hot tea, enjoying the subtle taste of honey and lemon. I set the ceramic mug down and tapped the play icon. The audio played through the speaker. "Aurora, call me back right now." The voice on the recording did not match the man on the porch. The lazy expectation was gone. The smug country club drawl had vanished. Richard sounded breathless. He sounded frantic. The syllables rushed together, tripping over one another in a chaotic sprint. His tone carried the high-pitched vibration of a man who just stepped out onto a frozen pond and heard the ice crack beneath his boots. "Answer your phone," he stammered, his breath hitching into the microphone. "Something is wrong with the planner. The vendor accounts are locked. Savannah is at the boutique. Aurora, call me back. Do not do this." I listened to the recording a second time. The raw desperation in his voice tasted sweeter than the tea. The legal strike had landed with flawless precision. My father woke up expecting to play the role of the generous billionaire. Instead, he woke up to a locked vault. He thought he could steal my independence without consequences because he assumed I lacked the resources to fight back. He forgot that resilience is built in the shadows, while arrogance dies in the light. I deleted the voicemail and set the phone face down on the table. My savings were safely frozen in the legal system, out of their reach. But paralyzing the funds was only the first move. The real chaos was just beginning. The Golden Child was currently standing inside the most exclusive bridal boutique in the city, expecting to purchase a fairy tale. I looked out the window at the snow-covered streets, wondering what happens when a spoiled princess tries to swipe a credit card that has suddenly been turned into a useless piece of plastic by a billionaire's legal team. My phone vibrated against the cheap wood of my dining table. The screen illuminated the dim kitchen, displaying a framed photograph of my younger sister, Savannah. The picture was taken last summer on a chartered yacht. She wore designer sunglasses and a practiced pout. I let the phone vibrate, tracking the rhythmic hum against the tabletop. It stopped. 10 seconds later, it started again. They were relentless. I picked up the device and accepted the call. I did not say hello. I just pressed the speaker to my ear and listened to the chaos unfolding on the other end of the line. Savannah was holding back tears. Her breath hitched in short, panicked gasps. She stood inside Le Rêve Bridal, the most exclusive wedding boutique in downtown Columbus. For the past 3 hours, she had been sipping complimentary champagne while attendants draped her in imported French lace and hand-sewn silk. She was born for that exact environment. Savannah never heard the word no during her entire childhood. When she secured a mediocre grade point average in high school, my father rewarded her with a brand new German sedan. She expected the world to hand her luxury on a silver platter. Now the silver platter was tarnished. Aurora, her voice trembled, pitching upward in a frantic whine. "Something is wrong with Dad's accounts. I am standing at the register. The custom veil is $15,000. I swiped his platinum card and the machine made a terrible buzzing noise. It declined the transaction. The screen said code 05, do not honor." I pictured the scene with clinical clarity. The boutique manager hovering over the marble counter, the sales associates who were just fawning over her flawless engagement ring, now exchanging uncomfortable sideways glances. The champagne suddenly tasting bitter, the intoxicating illusion of limitless wealth evaporating right in front of the cash register. Savannah sniffled into the microphone. Dad called the bank manager, she continued, her panic escalating. The manager said a federal injunction was filed against the wedding planner's escrow. He said the fraud department flagged Dad's primary portfolio as a flight risk. They locked everything, Aurora. His checking, his savings, his credit lines. The salesgirls are folding up my veil. They are looking at me like I am a beggar. Fix this. Before I could formulate a response, the sound of shuffling fabric and a heavy scuffle echoed through the line. Richard snatched the phone from her hand. I heard the heavy rush of winter wind. My father had stepped out onto the snowy sidewalk of High Street to hide his humiliation from the boutique staff. Traffic rumbled past him. "You called Elias Thorne," he hissed. His voice lacked the booming theatrical resonance he utilized during his Thanksgiving toast. He sounded ragged and hollow. "I called my grandfather," I corrected, keeping my tone even and quiet. "He made the arrangements. You stole an asset that did not belong to you. Grandfather deployed the necessary countermeasure to ensure the asset remained unspent." Richard let out a sharp, ragged exhale. The frosty Ohio air seemed to bite at his lungs. "You have no idea what you have done," he snapped. Thorne did not just freeze the vendor payouts. The legal filing triggered an automatic security protocol at my bank. The algorithms flagged my signature on the wire transfer as a disputed fiduciary breach. They threw a digital padlock over my entire net worth. I cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction settle over my shoulders. My father had operated his entire life under the assumption that his actions carried no consequences. He believed the rules of accountability only applied to the working class. Elias Thorne proved him wrong before breakfast. "Call off that crazy old man," Richard demanded. "Call Thorne and withdraw the injunction. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. If you do not unlock my portfolio right now, Chase Sterling and his family will walk away from this merger. Savannah will be ruined." I took a slow breath, tasting the lingering flavor of chamomile tea on my tongue. "I am not withdrawing anything," I replied. "You took my home deposit to buy a party. You had zero right to touch that custodial ledger." The silence on the line stretched tight. I could hear my father grinding his teeth. Then his rigid facade cracked. The arrogant patriarch dissolved, revealing the terrified, desperate man hiding beneath the tailored winter coat. "I had no choice, Aurora," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "I had to use your account." I paused. The sheer absurdity of his statement hung in the air. "You had no choice," I echoed. "You live in a 10,000-square-foot mansion. You drive a leased sports car. You spend your weekends playing golf at a country club that costs $30,000 a year. Sell a watch, sell a car. You did not have to rob your own daughter." "You do not understand business," he spat back, his pride wrestling with his panic. "The commercial credit lines are frozen. My real estate portfolio is currently locked under a routine bank audit. The auditors are scrutinizing the property valuations and pausing all capital withdrawals. I am illiquid. The wedding planner required a non-refundable deposit by Wednesday, or they were going to cancel the entire Winter Wonderland theme. Chase expects a certain standard. If I failed to produce the cash, the Sterling family would realize I am cash poor. I needed a bridge loan. I was going to pay you back after the audit cleared." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place, illuminating a horrifying and pathetic truth. The puzzle was no longer a mystery. My father was drowning. He did not steal my nursing wages simply because he was a narcissist who wanted to show off. He stole my wages because his empire was a house of cards, constructed on a foundation of hidden debt. The sprawling suburban mansion and the country club memberships were smokescreens. He was projecting the image of a titan of industry while secretly sweating over liquidity crises. He needed my $150,000 to maintain the illusion of the Harris dynasty just long enough to marry Savannah into the Sterling family wealth. He was essentially using my life savings to buy a wealthy son-in-law, hoping Chase would eventually bail out his sinking ship. "You are broke," I stated, stating the fact without a shred of sympathy. "You sacrificed my future to hide your own bankruptcy." "I am not broke," Richard snarled, his tone turning venomous. "I am experiencing a temporary cash flow interruption. You are ruining your sister's life out of pure spite. You are a bitter, jealous spinster, and you are tearing this family apart." I did not take the bait. I refused to engage in his emotional mudslinging. The numbers on a ledger do not lie. I hung up the phone, Richard. The injunction stays in place until every single cent is returned to my sole possession. My father let out a dark, terrifying scoff. He realized the paternal manipulation was failing. He pivoted to the only weapon he believed he still possessed. "If you do not call Elias Thorne by noon," he warned, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "I will call my estate attorney. I will write you out of the family trust. I will remove your name from the inheritance. You will not see a single dime of my estate. You will be dead to me." I listened to his threat, feeling the last, lingering tether of my childhood respect snap and wither away. I looked around my modest apartment, built with my own hands, funded by my own sweat. I did not need his fake empire. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound surprised even me. "What will?" I asked. Richard fell silent. "You just confessed that your credit lines are audited, and you had to steal from a pediatric nurse to buy a wedding cake." I continued, my voice stripped of all emotion. "You have no estate left to inherit, Richard. Keep your imaginary trust. I just want my cash." I tapped the red icon on the screen, ending the call. The dial tone clicked, replacing the sound of high street traffic with the quiet hum of my refrigerator. I set the device down. The initial strike was a flawless victory. I paralyzed his funds and exposed his hidden financial rot. He could not fight me in the banking sector anymore because he lacked the ammunition. But I knew the war was far from over. A narcissist stripped of his financial power is a dangerous creature. He could not outspend me. He could not outsmart Elias Thorne. He had to pivot to an entirely different battlefield. He had to wage a psychological war. Cornered animals fight dirty. When they cannot destroy your bank account, they target the one asset you cannot lock behind a digital firewall. They target your name. I walked over to the kitchen window, watching the snow drift down over the parking lot. I knew the retaliation was coming. The only question was how far they would go to destroy my reputation and force my hand. I spent Saturday morning trying to establish a sense of normalcy. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and organized my nursing scrubs for the upcoming week. The apartment remained quiet. I assumed my father was busy navigating the fallout at the boutique or scrambling to placate his angry vendors. I underestimated their capacity for immediate retaliation. At precisely 10 in the morning, my phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. It was not a phone call. It was a notification chime, then another, then a rapid succession of pings overlapping one another until the device emitted a continuous buzzing sound. I unlocked the screen. The notifications were pouring in from Facebook. I tapped the blue icon and the application opened directly to my mother's profile page. Brenda Harris had posted a long status update. She attached a curated photograph from last Thanksgiving showing our entire family smiling around the dinner table. The image was a polished illusion hiding a fractured reality. I began to read the block of text beneath the photo. A cold, heavy knot formed behind my ribs. Brenda played the role of the devastated matriarch flawlessly. She addressed her hundreds of suburban friends, her country club associates, and the members of her church congregation. She wrote that she was sharing this pain to ask for prayers during a dark season. She claimed I was suffering from a severe mental health crisis. She spun a narrative framing my years of grueling hospital shifts as the root cause of a psychological breakdown. According to her post, the stress of being an unmarried, overworked nurse had finally fractured my grip on reality. She told her audience I was consumed by a bitter, toxic jealousy over Savannah finding true love. The post stated that I had manipulated my elderly grandfather, who she described as experiencing cognitive decline, into legally freezing Savannah's wedding funds out of pure spite. She painted my sister as a heartbroken victim whose fairy tale was being held hostage by a deeply unstable sibling. The comments section was a digital firing squad. Aunt Clara wrote that she always knew I harbored a dark heart. Cousin David suggested I be institutionalized for my own safety. Women from my mother's tennis league left praying hands emojis and offered their sympathies for having to deal with such a selfish daughter. My inbox filled with direct messages from extended relatives calling me a bitter spinster and a disgrace to the Harris name. Then a text message arrived that chilled the blood in my veins. It was from Sarah, a fellow charge nurse at the pediatric hospital. The message contained a screenshot of Brenda's post and a brief note. Aurora people in the break room are sharing this. The nursing director asked if you needed an emergency leave of absence. Please tell me you are okay. I sat down on a bar stool, resting my elbows on the kitchen counter. The air in my apartment felt thin and suffocating. A smear campaign within a family is painful but manageable. A smear campaign that infiltrates your workplace is lethal. In the medical field, reputation and mental stability are paramount. If the hospital administration believed I was experiencing a psychotic break driven by jealousy, my career could be suspended pending a psychological evaluation. They were not just trying to steal my home deposit anymore. They were trying to destroy my livelihood. For a brief, agonizing minute, the pressure felt insurmountable. The weight of the public shaming pressed down on my shoulders. I felt an intense urge to pick up the phone, call Elias Thorne, and tell him to release the injunction. I wanted the notifications to stop. I wanted to fade back into the background and reclaim my quiet life. That is how emotional abuse operates. It isolates you until compliance feels like the only method of survival. Years of handling critical care scenarios trained my brain to look past the panic and analyze the symptoms. I picked up my phone and reread the post. I studied the sentence structure. I scrutinized the vocabulary. A glaring inconsistency jumped off the screen. Brenda was a woman who communicated in emotional platitudes and Southern hospitality cliches. She did not use corporate jargon. The second paragraph contained a very specific string of words. It read, "We must protect the optics of this societal merger to ensure the stakeholders of our family do not suffer reputational damage." Further down, the term brand synergy was woven into a sentence about Savannah's wedding registry. My mother did not know what brand synergy meant. She did not refer to her friends and relatives as stakeholders. The post was a red herring. Brenda did not write it. She merely allowed it to be published under her name. Chase Sterling wrote it. The finance fiancé was orchestrating the digital warfare. I stared at the corporate buzzwords, realizing the true nature of my adversary. Richard was frantic and desperate, but Chase was cold and calculated. Why was the future son-in-law so heavily invested in destroying my credibility? If the wedding was simply delayed due to a banking error, a wealthy finance executive would just write a check to cover the floral deposits. Instead, Chase was taking the time to draft defamatory statements to isolate me from my support system. He needed me silenced. He needed to ensure that if I spoke out, no one would believe a single word I said. The realization eradicated any lingering urge to surrender. The fear vanished, replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. I was not dealing with a family misunderstanding. I was dealing with a coordinated threat. I opened my laptop and began taking high-resolution screenshots of the original post. I captured every defamatory comment from the extended family. I documented the timestamps and the profiles. In the state of Ohio, publishing false statements that jeopardize a medical professional's license constitutes defamation per se. They handed me actionable evidence wrapped in a digital bow. I forwarded the entire compiled file to Elias Thorne with a brief instruction to add the screenshots to our legal arsenal. I closed the laptop and set my phone to silent mode, cutting off the digital noise. They failed to break my resolve online. The social media strike did not force me into submission. Narcissists rarely accept defeat gracefully. When an indirect attack fails, they pivot to a direct confrontation. I looked at the hospital scrubs laid out on my couch, preparing for my Sunday morning shift. The digital war was over. The physical war was about to begin. With her reputation in tatters, what happens when the golden child decides a Facebook post is not enough and brings the fight directly to my workplace? The fluorescent lights of the pediatric intensive care unit buzzed with a low, sterile hum. Sunday morning shifts always carried a distinct tension. Parents sat in hard plastic chairs, staring through clear incubators, praying for their fragile infants to gain another ounce of weight. I spent the first 6 hours of my shift checking vitals, adjusting oxygen flows, and charting medications. The neonatal ward demanded a sharp clinical focus that left no room for personal grievances. I pushed the digital smear campaign out of my mind and did the job I was trained to do. Around 1 in the afternoon, my charge nurse told me to take a lunch break. The hospital cafeteria sat on the ground floor, a sprawling room filled with the smell of bleached floors and stale coffee. I purchased a black coffee and walked toward an empty table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the Columbus snow continued to fall, blanketing the employee parking lot. I barely had time to take my first sip before the heavy glass doors of the cafeteria slid open. The rhythmic, sharp click of leather-heeled boots echoed across the linoleum floor. I did not need to turn around to know who had just arrived. The sound was distinct and purposeful. I turned my head and watched my younger sister march through the tables. Savannah looked entirely out of place in a hospital ward. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat tailored perfectly to her waist, paired with designer leather boots that cost more than my monthly rent. A quilted leather handbag rested on her forearm. She carried the unmistakable aura of country club wealth, an illusion funded entirely by the money stolen from my bank account. She did not come alone. She brought her sense of theatrical entitlement. Savannah stopped at my table and crossed her arms. Her face was flushed from the winter cold, but her eyes carried a calculated, performative grief. She knew several nurses and doctors were sitting nearby eating their lunches. She knew they had likely seen the Facebook post orchestrated by Chase. She was here to solidify the narrative of the unstable, jealous sibling. "Aurora, how could you do this to us?" Savannah asked. She did not whisper. She projected her voice, ensuring the syllables carried across the quiet cafeteria. A few heads turned in our direction. A resident doctor sitting 2 tables away lowered his sandwich. I kept my hands wrapped around the warm paper cup. I did not stand up. I did not match her volume. Giving her a screaming match would only validate the rumors circulating online. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to fill the void. "You are ruining the most important day of my life," Savannah continued, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "You manipulated Grandpa into hiring lawyers because you cannot stand the fact that I am getting married while you are stuck working double shifts. You need to call the bank and unlock the vendor escrow right now." I studied my sister. She was 26 years old, but she possessed the emotional maturity of a toddler deprived of a toy. She honestly believed the legal system operated like a retail complaint line. She thought I could simply call a toll-free number and release an injunction authorized by a federal magistrate. "The money is frozen, Savannah," I said, keeping my tone quiet and measured. "It will remain frozen until a judge reviews the wire fraud. I do not have a magic key." Savannah scoffed, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. She leaned closer, resting her manicured hands on the cafeteria table. Her perfume, a heavy floral scent, overpowered the smell of the hospital coffee. "You are pathetic," she hissed, dropping the wounded bride act for a moment. "You think you are teaching Dad a lesson, but you are just embarrassing yourself. Chase is going to fix this. You have no idea who you are dealing with. The Sterling family has more money than you will ever see in your lifetime." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "If Chase is so incredibly wealthy," I asked, "why did our father need to steal a pediatric nurse's savings account to pay for your wedding cake? Why did the finance prodigy not simply write a check for his own bride?" Savannah straightened her posture, deploying a defense she clearly memorized from her fiancé. "Chase is a hedge fund manager," she stated, her chin lifted in arrogant defiance. "His capital is currently tied up in offshore accounts. International tax laws require a waiting period before he can liquidate foreign assets without facing steep penalty fees. He is protecting his portfolio. Dad offered to front the vendor costs as a temporary bridge loan." A deep, profound sense of dramatic irony washed over me. I sat in a room designed to triage medical emergencies and listened to my sister diagnose her own financial ruin without even realizing it. To a woman accustomed to luxury, the phrase offshore hedge fund accounts sounded like the pinnacle of elite wealth. To a woman who spent 7 years building her own independence, the phrase sounded like the oldest grift in the book. Legitimate billionaires do not ask their future father-in-law to steal from a sibling to pay for floral arrangements. They do not claim their entire fortune is paralyzed by vague international tax laws right before a major expense. Chase Sterling was not protecting a portfolio. Chase Sterling was a parasite. I looked at Savannah. The anger I felt the night before morphed into a cold, clinical pity. She was standing in my workplace, wearing stolen clothes, defending a man who was using her as a shield. She was walking blindfolded into a disaster. I set my coffee cup down. I stood up, bringing myself eye to eye with her. I did not raise my voice. I leaned in, close enough that only she could hear the words. "Savannah," I whispered, "have you ever actually seen his bank statements, or have you just seen his Instagram?" The question landed with the precision of a surgical scalpel. Savannah opened her mouth to snap a reply, but the words died in her throat. Her brow furrowed. The unyielding, arrogant confidence cracked right down the middle. I watched the cognitive dissonance register in her eyes. I watched her mentally rewind every conversation, every excuse, every vague promise Chase ever made about his elusive wealth. She had never seen a ledger. She had never seen a deed. She only knew the designer suits and the rented luxury cars. Her face drained of color. The pristine white cashmere coat suddenly looked heavy and suffocating. She stood speechless in the middle of the cafeteria. I picked up my badge from the table. "Tell Chase he needs a better script," I said. I walked past her, leaving her stranded under the fluorescent lights. I finished my shift with a quiet sense of triumph. The digital smear campaign lost its power. Savannah arrived expecting an easy victory and left carrying a seed of crippling doubt. The facade of the Sterling dynasty was beginning to crumble. At 4 p.m, I clocked out and walked to the employee parking lot. The Ohio winter sky was already turning a deep, bruised purple. I unlocked my sedan and turned the ignition, letting the heater warm the freezing cabin. I was scheduled to drive to Cleveland to meet Elias Thorne for my first official legal strategy session. I put the car in gear, ready to finalize the civil suit and reclaim my stolen funds. Before I could pull out of the parking space, my phone rang through the dashboard speakers. The caller ID displayed the name of the boutique law firm in Cleveland. I tapped the screen to answer. Aurora Elias Thorne said. His voice lacked the crisp, confident rhythm from the night before. He sounded gravely serious. "Are you driving right now?" I pressed the brake pedal, shifting the car back into park. "I am still in the hospital parking lot," I replied. "I am about to head north." "Cancel the drive," Elias instructed. "You need to go home and secure your doors." The forensic accounting team spent the weekend pulling the preliminary public records on your father's commercial real estate properties. We were looking for the exact paper trail of the custodial wire transfer. We found something else. My heart skipped a beat. The lingering satisfaction from my cafeteria victory vanished entirely. "What did you find?" I asked. Elias let out a heavy breath. "The $150,000 is pocket change, Aurora. Richard did not just exploit a joint checking account. We pulled the deeds on Harrison's manufacturing warehouses. Your father has been forging your grandfather's signature on a power of attorney for the last 5 years. He cross-collateralized the entire commercial portfolio to take out high-interest loans. He's been funding his country club lifestyle with fraudulent banknotes." The freezing air inside the car felt thick and suffocating. I stared at the snow-covered windshield, trying to process the magnitude of the revelation. "This is not a civil dispute over a wedding budget anymore," Elias continued, his tone grim and absolute. "This is systemic federal wire fraud. We are no longer discussing restitution. We are discussing prison sentences." The ground beneath my feet shifted. The narrative of the jealous sister and the stolen wedding dress evaporated. I was holding a detonator that would eradicate my parents' freedom. I sat in the dark parking lot, realizing the war had just escalated beyond my control. What massive secret has Elias Thorne uncovered that turns a family dispute into a federal crime? The freezing wind whipped against the glass facade of the downtown high-rise as I navigated my old sedan into the underground parking garage. I did not go home and lock my doors. When an attorney tells you your family dispute has mutated into a federal crime, hiding under a blanket is not a viable strategy. I instructed Elias Thorne to meet me at his firm's local Columbus annex. I gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, my mind racing through a labyrinth of terrifying possibilities. The law office occupied the 20th floor. The reception area smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. A paralegal escorted me into a sprawling conference room overlooking the snow-dusted city skyline. Elias Thorne sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. He wore a crisp charcoal suit, his posture rigid and unyielding. The surface of the table was covered in thick manila folders and stacked financial ledgers. At the far end of the room, a large flat-screen monitor glowed against the dark-paneled wall. My grandfather, Harrison, stared out from the digital feed. He sat in his Cleveland study, a heavy wool cardigan draped over his shoulders. His face resembled carved granite. The icy blue of his eyes translated clearly through the high-definition camera. He did not offer a comforting smile. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield after a catastrophic defeat. I pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down across from Elias. The room was unnervingly quiet, save for the low hum of the ventilation system. I unbuttoned my coat, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. "Show me," I said, keeping my voice steady. Elias opened the thickest manila folder. He slid a stack of high-resolution photocopies across the smooth wood. The documents were bank records, property deeds, and notarized legal forms. "The $150,000 Richard took from your custodial ledger was a symptom," Elias began, his tone clinical and detached. "It was a single cough signaling a terminal disease. When we secured the injunction against the wedding planner, the presiding magistrate required a preliminary review of your father's financial standing to justify the freeze. My forensic accountants pulled his public credit profile. The numbers did not align with his lifestyle. We dug deeper into the commercial registries tied to the Harris name." Elias tapped a silver pen against a specific notarized document. The paper bore the official seal of the state of Ohio. "5 years ago," Elias continued, "your father filed a durable power of attorney, granting himself sweeping executive control over Harrison's commercial real estate portfolio. The portfolio includes the manufacturing warehouses, the distribution centers, and the raw land holdings in the industrial district." I leaned forward, inspecting the document. My grandfather's bold, sweeping signature sat at the bottom of the page, right next to a notary stamp. I looked up at the video monitor. Harrison held my gaze, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath his weathered skin. "I never signed that paper," my grandfather stated, his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal fury. "Richard forged my name. He bribed a desperate notary to stamp a counterfeit document. He gave himself the keys to my kingdom while I was undergoing heart surgery 5 years ago." A wave of vertigo washed over me. I pressed my palms flat against the mahogany table to ground myself. My father, a man who prided himself on his moral superiority at every Sunday church service, was a document forger. Elias picked up the narrative outlining the mechanics of the theft. Richard did not steal liquid cash from Harrison. That would have triggered immediate audits from the corporate accountants. Instead, he used the forged power of attorney to cross-collateralize the real estate. Your father took out massive, high-interest commercial loans using Harrison's unencumbered warehouses as the collateral. The illusion of the Harris family dynasty shattered right in front of my eyes. The sprawling suburban mansion, the country club dues, the imported luxury vehicles, the designer clothes Savannah wore to the hospital cafeteria, none of it was earned. All of it was purchased with stolen equity. Richard spent half a decade treating his father's life work like a personal slush fund to finance a phantom aristocracy. But phantom empires require a constant influx of cash to satisfy the creditors. Elias opened a second folder, revealing a series of red-lined banking statements. The shell game collapsed 3 weeks ago, Elias explained. The commercial lenders initiated a routine audit on the warehouse valuations. They discovered discrepancies in the localized revenue reports and paused all of Richard's credit lines. The localized debt came due. Your father missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments on his own suburban estate. Elias slid a final document across the table. It was a formal notice of default. The bank was preparing to foreclose on the Columbus mansion. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. The Winter Wonderland wedding was never about celebrating Savannah finding true love. The event was a desperate theatrical production designed to secure a financial lifeline. Richard believed Chase Sterling possessed elite offshore wealth. My father needed to finalize the marriage swiftly, tying the Harris family to the Sterling family before the bank placed a padlock on his front door. He needed liquid cash to pay the wedding vendors because his fraudulent credit lines were frozen. My legacy savings account was the only unmonitored ledger left in his orbit. He drained my home deposit to buy a societal merger, hoping his new wealthy son-in-law would eventually bail him out of foreclosure. He sacrificed my future to hide his own criminal incompetence. Elias folded his hands, resting them on top of the files. The civil injunction we filed yesterday paralyzed the stolen wedding funds, he said. But advancing this case into the discovery phase changes the legal landscape. If we depose Richard to recover your cash, the forged power of attorney and the bank fraud will enter the official court record. As officers of the court, we are mandated to report systemic financial crimes to the federal authorities. I stared at the lawyer, the implications settling heavy in my chest. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. It means the Federal Bureau of Investigation takes over, Elias replied, his gaze unflinching. Bank fraud and aggravated identity theft carry mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. If we press this button, your father faces a multi-count federal indictment. We are looking at a realistic outcome of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. A sour taste coated the back of my throat. I wanted my independence back. I wanted the contractor invoice for my downtown condo paid. I wanted the arrogant smirks wiped off their faces. But I never intended to wear the mantle of an executioner. The prospect of sending the man who taught me how to drive a car into a concrete prison cell made me physically sick. I looked at the video screen. Harrison watched me, studying my reaction. He did not pressure me. He knew the burden of this decision rested entirely on my shoulders. I held the detonator to my parents' freedom. If I walked away and dropped the civil suit, Richard would keep my money, but he might evade federal prison. If I fought for my own survival, I would burn my family to ashes. The silence in the glass-walled office grew suffocating. The sheer weight of the impending choice pressed down on my lungs, restricting my breath. I closed my eyes, seeking a fleeting moment of clarity in the darkness. A sharp, melodic chime shattered the quiet. My phone vibrated against the polished wood of the conference table. I opened my eyes and looked down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I stared at the device. Just hours ago, Richard was screaming threats into the receiver, vowing to disinherit me and destroy my life. Now he was calling back. I expected another barrage of furious insults. I expected more blustering arrogance. I reached out and swiped the green icon, placing the call on the speaker setting for Elias and Harrison to hear. "Aurora," my father said. His voice was a jarring departure from the morning confrontation. The venom was gone. The frantic, breathless panic had evaporated. Instead, he sounded remarkably calm, soothing, and gentle. It was the exact tone he used when I was a little girl nursing a scraped knee. It was a voice engineered to project safety and unconditional love. "Sweetheart," he continued, his words soft and measured, "I have been doing a lot of thinking. We let things get entirely out of hand. Family should never fight like this. Please let me buy you a cup of coffee. We can sit down, just the two of us, and fix everything. I want to make this right." The sudden pivot was terrifying. A predator does not sheath its claws unless it is preparing to lure you into a trap. I sat in the sterile boardroom surrounded by the undeniable evidence of his felony crimes, listening to the man attempt to weave a brand new illusion. How will Richard try to manipulate Aurora into saving him from a prison sentence? I ended the call on speakerphone and agreed to meet him in 1 hour. Elias Thorne delivered a stark warning before I walked out of the glass-walled conference room. He told me a desperate man will utilize any tool available to avoid a steel cage. Harrison remained silent on the video feed, his icy blue eyes conveying a quiet command to hold the line. I left the high-rise and drove to a small independent coffee shop situated on the edge of the Columbus suburbs. The neutral territory was intentional. Richard chose a public space filled with college students and remote workers, knowing I would refrain from causing a scene. The brass bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans, melting snow, and sweet vanilla syrup. The industrial espresso machines hissed loudly, drowning out the low murmur of overlapping conversations. I scanned the crowded room and spotted my father sitting in a corner booth near the frosted back windows. He did not look like the arrogant patriarch who raised a crystal flute 24 hours ago. He stripped away the polished veneer. He wore a simple, gray, cable-knit sweater. His shoulders slumped forward, projecting an aura of immense fatigue. The lines around his eyes appeared deeper, etched with a profound exhaustion. He played the role of the humbled, broken man flawlessly. I walked over and slid into the wooden booth across from him. A steaming paper cup sat on my side of the small table. A custom-printed sleeve wrapped around the cardboard. A caramel macchiato with oat milk and a dash of cinnamon. My favorite drink. He remembered an insignificant detail from my college years, using it to manufacture a swift sense of intimate paternal care. "Aurora," he said, his voice barely rising above a hoarse whisper, "thank you for coming. I know you had every right to ignore my call." I looked at the coffee cup but did not reach for it. I kept my hands folded tight in my lap. "I am here, Richard," I replied. "Say what you need to say." He let out a long, trembling sigh. He folded his hands on the table, bowing his head slightly toward the wood grain. "I am sorry," he murmured. "I lost my temper this morning. I said things I deeply regret. The pressure of the last few weeks has been crushing me, and I took it out on you. You are my daughter. I love you. Family should never end up in a standoff like this." He reached inside his coat pocket and withdrew a thick white envelope. He placed it gently on the table between us. "I want to make things right," he continued. "I scraped together $5,000 in cash. It is yours right now. I know it does not replace what I borrowed, but it is a start." He reached back into his pocket and produced a single sheet of paper along with a silver pen. I drafted a formal promissory note for the remaining $145,000. I pledge to pay you back, with interest, the moment my commercial audits clear. He leaned forward, his dark eyes shining with unshed tears. He lowered his voice, adopting a rich, comforting resonance. "I want you standing next to your sister tomorrow. I want you to be Savannah's maid of honor. You belong at the front of the church with your family. We need you, Aurora. Please, let us hit the reset button." The psychological manipulation exerted a heavy gravitational pull. For a fleeting, painful moment, the exhausted child buried deep inside my chest desperately wanted to believe him. I spent my entire life standing in the background, watching my parents shower Savannah with affection and limitless resources. I craved their validation. I yearned for the loving father who fixed broken bicycles and chased away the monsters hiding under the bed. He sat across from me, offering the exact validation I always wanted, wrapped in a warm, nostalgic package. The urge to take the envelope, drink the coffee, and pretend the nightmare never happened pulsed through my veins. Then he slid one final document across the table. It was a standard legal form printed on crisp, white paper. "I just need you to sign this simple release of claims," he said, his tone casual and breezy. "The wedding planner requires a signed waiver to unfreeze the caterers and the venue deposits. Once you sign this, the injunction drops and we can all move forward. It is just a formality." My medical training operates on a very specific protocol. When a trauma patient enters the emergency room, you do not listen to their verbal assurances. A patient will tell you they feel fine while suffering from internal bleeding. You ignore the narrative and read the vital signs. You look for the hidden symptoms. I looked past my father's tears and studied his baseline. I observed the rapid, shallow rhythm of his breathing. I noticed a subtle tremor in his left hand, the way his index finger tapped nervously against the edge of the table. A thin sheen of cold sweat gathered at his temples, despite the cool temperature inside the coffee shop. His pupils were dilated, indicating a severe adrenaline response. He was not a humbled father seeking reconciliation. He was a cornered predator executing a survival tactic. I ignored the pen and picked up the paper. The document lacked the letterhead of a wedding planner. It contained dense legal terminology. I read the fine print, scanning the paragraphs with cold clinical detachment. The text did not mention caterers or floral deposits. It was a retroactive indemnification clause. The legal jargon laid bare the true nature of his olive branch. By signing the paper, I would officially authorize the withdrawal from my custodial ledger. The document stated I granted prior consent for Richard to utilize the $150,000 for general family expenses. It contained a comprehensive hold harmless agreement absolving him of all fiduciary duties related to the account. He was not trying to save Savannah's wedding reception. He was trying to save himself from a federal penitentiary. Elias Thorne and the forensic accountants uncovered the forged power of attorney, tying him to extensive bank fraud. If I filed a civil suit, the discovery phase would hand the federal authorities the key to his cell. He needed my signature to legalize the theft. If I retroactively approved the withdrawal, the criminal intent regarding my ledger vanished. He could use my signed waiver as a shield to block Harrison's legal clawback and muddy the waters of his wider financial crimes. The warm, nostalgic illusions shattered, leaving nothing but the cold, hard truth. The coffee sat untouched, cooling in its paper cup. I looked at the $5,000 envelope. It was a cheap bribe intended to purchase his freedom. I placed the document back on the table. I used my index finger to slide the paper and the silver pen across the smooth wood, returning them to his side. I am not signing a retroactive authorization, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, steady register. I know about the forged power of attorney. I know about the commercial real estate loans. Elias Thorne pulled the deeds this morning. I know you are facing federal bank fraud. You did not invite me here to fix our family. You invited me here to sign your get-out-of-jail-free card. The transformation occurred in a fraction of a second. The humbled, broken patriarch vanished. The facade of the loving father dissolved into thin air. His posture snapped rigid. The fabricated tears dried, instantly replaced by a dark, venomous glare. The muscles in his jaw locked, tightening the skin across his cheekbones. He realized the manipulation failed. He realized the scapegoat daughter possessed a comprehensive map of his criminal empire. He picked up the silver pen, gripping the metal barrel so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He leaned across the small table, invading my physical space, the smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the bitter scent of stale espresso. He no longer needed the carrot. He reached for the stick. When the mask slips, what terrifying threat will Richard use to force her compliance? The bustling noise of the coffee shop faded into a low, distant hum. The hiss of the espresso machine and the chatter of college students felt miles away. The small wooden table became an isolated battleground. Richard stared at me with a cold, unblinking intensity. His eyes, a shade of dark brown I inherited, but never truly recognized, mirrored the bottom of a frozen well. The paternal warmth vanished, leaving behind a chilling, predatory calculation. He realized the charm offensive failed. He realized the $5,000 bribe and the emotional manipulation lacked the necessary leverage to secure his freedom. He leaned across the table, bridging the physical distance between us. "I am not asking for your permission, Aurora," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing gravel. "I am giving you an instruction. You will pick up that pen and you will sign the release form. You will call Elias Thorne and instruct him to withdraw the injunction immediately." I held his gaze, refusing to break eye contact. "And if I decline?" I asked, keeping my tone flat and even. Richard curled his lip into a sneer. The ugly arrogance of a man accustomed to crushing his opposition surfaced. "Then I will make a phone call to the Columbus Police Department," he stated. "I will walk into the precinct and file a formal criminal complaint against my own daughter." I waited for the punchline, expecting another hollow threat regarding the family trust or social exile. The threat he delivered was far more devastating. "I will file a sworn affidavit claiming you committed elder abuse against your grandfather." He continued, leaning closer. "I will tell the detectives that you exploited a vulnerable 80-year-old man, manipulating a cognitively impaired senior citizen into launching a baseless legal attack against his own son. I will provide a compelling narrative. I will claim the stress of watching your younger sister secure a wealthy marriage caused you to suffer a psychotic break. I will state that you hijacked Harrison's legal counsel out of pure, malicious jealousy." A cold, jagged spike of adrenaline pierced my chest. The threat was not a random empty insult. It was a precision-guided missile aimed directly at the foundation of my entire life. "You know Harrison is perfectly lucid," I countered, my voice remaining steady despite the sudden spike in my heart rate. "You know he directed Elias Thorne to pull the commercial deeds. The police will investigate and find nothing." Richard smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. "It does not matter what the detectives eventually find," he whispered. "You work in pediatric critical care. You hold a specialized state medical license. The moment a formal police report alleging elder abuse enters the system, the Ohio Board of Nursing receives an automatic notification. The regulatory protocols mandate an immediate administrative suspension of your clinical credentials pending a full investigation." The air in my lungs turned stale and thin. He understood the exact mechanics of my profession. He knew the bureaucratic machinery of the medical board lacked nuance. An allegation of exploiting a vulnerable patient, even a relative, triggers an instantaneous professional exile to protect public safety. "You will not be allowed to step foot inside a hospital," he added, twisting the knife deeper. "You will lose your job. You will lose your income. You will spend the next year draining whatever meager savings you have left, paying defense attorneys to clear your name. By the time the state reinstates your license, your professional reputation will be permanently stained. No reputable clinic will hire a nurse with a documented history of elder abuse allegations. You will be broke, jobless, and shunned by the very society you worked so hard to impress." The conflict mutated, escalating from a civil dispute over stolen cash to an existential threat against my very survival. My father was not just trying to avoid a prison cell. He was actively attempting to annihilate the career I spent 7 grueling years building. He intended to strip away my identity, my purpose, and my ability to feed myself. "Sign the paper, Aurora," he demanded, tapping his index finger against the signature line of the legal document. "Sign it, and you can go back to your quiet little life. Fight me, and I will ensure you spend the rest of your days working a cash register." He leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms over his chest, radiating a suffocating, absolute confidence. He believed he secured the checkmate. He believed the sheer, terrifying weight of his threat would crush my spine, forcing my immediate compliance. He expected the obedient scapegoat to surrender to protect her livelihood. I looked down at the table, observing the silver pen resting next to the release form. I looked at the $5,000 envelope sitting near the untouched caramel macchiato. I looked back up at the man who birthed me. "You spent my entire life underestimating me, Richard," I said, my voice soft, calm, and entirely devoid of fear. "You assumed I was quiet because I was weak. You failed to realize I was quiet because I was watching you. I watched you lie to the country club members. I watched you manipulate Savannah. I watched you build a fake empire on a foundation of rotting sand." I reached inside the deep pocket of my wool coat. I bypassed my cellular phone and wrapped my fingers around a small, rectangular device I purchased during my nursing residency to record complicated medical lectures. I pulled the digital voice recorder out and placed it gently on the wooden table right next to his legal waiver. A tiny red light blinked on the top of the black plastic casing. The smug confidence on my father's face evaporated. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes locked onto the blinking red light, tracking the rhythmic pulse. I turned the device on before I walked through the door, I explained, tapping the plastic casing with my fingernail. It captured the fake apology. It captured the $5,000 bribe. Most importantly, it captured the last 3 minutes of dialogue. I leaned forward, mirroring his earlier posture. It captured you explicitly threatening to manufacture a false police report regarding elder abuse to coerce me into signing a legal document absolving you of fiduciary fraud. I continued detailing the exact legal parameters of his mistake. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His jaw worked silently, struggling to process the catastrophic reversal of power. Elias Thorne is going to find this audio file incredibly useful, I added, standing up from the booth. Witness tampering, extortion, and filing a false police report look absolutely fantastic, layered on top of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You just handed the district attorney the final nail for your coffin. I slipped the digital recorder back into my coat pocket. I did not touch the money. I did not touch the coffee. I left the unsigned release form sitting on the table. Do not call my phone again, I stated, looking down at the broken, terrified man trembling in the booth. The next time you hear my name, it will be read into the official court record. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him stranded in a prison of his own making. The brass bell chimed as I pushed through the heavy glass door, stepping back into the freezing Ohio wind. The cold air felt invigorating, crisp and clean. The paralyzing fear vanished, replaced by an ironclad, unyielding resilience. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Elias Thorne. The lawyer answered on the first ring. Elias, I said, marching across the snow-covered parking lot toward my car, we are done negotiating. The gloves are off. I authorize the firm to go full scorched earth, subpoena every single ledger tied to his name, submit the forged power of attorney to the federal authorities. Understood, Aurora the attorney replied, his tone sharp and ready. We will initiate the discovery filings immediately. Wait, I added, pausing with my hand on the frozen door handle of my sedan. A new thought crystallized in my mind, piercing through the adrenaline. My father orchestrated the theft, but another man stood to benefit directly from the stolen cash. Another man orchestrated the digital smear campaign, attempting to destroy my credibility before I could expose the missing funds. Elias, I said, gripping the door handle tight, I need your private investigators to pull the financial dossiers on Savannah's fiancé. I want a complete audit of Chase Sterling. I want to know exactly what kind of dynasty my sister is marrying into. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, shutting out the winter wind. The focus shifted, the target acquired. Aurora turns her attention to the fiancé. What terrifying truth is Chase hiding beneath his tailored suits and his offshore hedge fund illusions? The Ohio winter dragged into early December. The snowbanks hardened into dirty gray ice along the edges of the hospital parking lot. Inside the neonatal ward, I maintained my grueling schedule, pulling 12-hour shifts and charting patient vitals with meticulous care. The digital smear campaign on Facebook faded into yesterday's gossip. My nursing license remained secure, protected by the digital voice recording currently resting in a fireproof safe at the law offices of Elias Thorne. Richard went dark. There were no more threatening phone calls. There were no more fake apologies. The silence felt heavy, pregnant with the suffocating anticipation of an impending strike. On a Tuesday afternoon, I sat in the hospital break room eating a cold turkey sandwich when my phone vibrated. A secure, encrypted email arrived from the investigative branch of Elias Thorne's firm. The subject line read, Sterling Financial Dossier. I set the sandwich down. I tapped the screen, opening the attached PDF file. I expected to find a few unpaid parking tickets or an exaggerated job title. I assumed Chase Sterling was simply a mid-level finance manager inflating his net worth to impress my gullible parents. The reality buried inside the 60-page document dropped a jaw-dropping plot twist onto the break room table. Chase Sterling was not a wealthy finance prodigy. He did not manage offshore hedge funds. He did not hold a degree from a prestigious Ivy League university. Chase Sterling was a failed cryptocurrency day trader, drowning in catastrophic, aggressive gambling debt. I scrolled through the pages, my eyes scanning the staggering columns of red ink. The investigators pulled his civil court records spanning the last 3 years. Chase faced multiple active judgments from unsecured creditors. He owed over $200,000 to a network of aggressive, unregulated lending syndicates operating out of Las Vegas and Miami. He lived in a rented luxury apartment, 3 months past due on rent. His tailored suits were purchased on high-interest credit cards currently sitting in collections. The luxury sports car he drove to our Thanksgiving dinner was leased under a fabricated corporate entity. The entire Sterling family dynasty was a ghost, a fabricated illusion built on leverage and lies. I continued scrolling, feeling a cold, sickening dread pool in my stomach. The document contained a secondary report focused on the specific routing details of my stolen $150,000. Elias Thorne requested the investigators trace the exact corporate structure of Sterling Event Planning, the luxury wedding planner Richard wired my money to. The findings shattered the entire premise of the Winter Wonderland wedding. Sterling Event Planning did not exist. There were no floral vendors. There were no ice sculptors. There were no caviar deposits. The company was a registered limited liability shell corporation. The investigators pulled the articles of incorporation and traced the managing members. The shell company was owned and operated by the exact same aggressive lending syndicate currently holding Chase Sterling's $200,000 gambling debt. The wedding was a Trojan horse. The pieces of the massive grift snapped together, illuminating a horrifying criminal conspiracy. Chase targeted my sister because Richard bragged loudly at the country club about the Harris family wealth and the untouchable legacy trust funds. Chase needed a massive, immediate cash injection to stop his creditors from initiating severe physical collections. He convinced my father to wire the $150,000 wedding budget directly into the shell company, assuming the funds would immediately launder through the system and clear his gambling ledger the moment the marriage certificate was signed. Savannah was a clueless pawn in a desperate high-stakes collision between two broke, arrogant men. My father stole my life savings to buy a wealthy son-in-law, hoping Chase would bail out his foreclosed mansion. Chase manufactured a fake wedding to steal my father's money, hoping Richard would bail out his gambling debts. They were two drowning men attempting to use each other as a life raft, entirely unaware that they were both holding on to anchors. The narrative tension skyrocketed, sending a fresh wave of adrenaline through my veins. I sat in the break room, staring at the undeniable proof of the fraud. The civil injunction Elias Thorne filed on Black Friday did not just ruin Savannah's dress fitting, it legally paralyzed the cash right before it transferred into the hands of a dangerous lending syndicate. Chase was currently trapped in Columbus, entirely exposed, unable to pay his bookies, and unable to access my frozen savings account. I locked my phone and leaned back against the hard plastic chair. A profound moral dilemma presented itself, demanding an immediate choice. Savannah publicly humiliated me in the hospital cafeteria just days ago. She paraded her stolen cashmere coat and mocked my quiet, modest lifestyle. She blindly defended a parasite who orchestrated a digital smear campaign designed to destroy my career. A vindictive part of my soul wanted to delete the email, walk away, and let the wedding proceed. I could let her marry a broke crypto fraudster and watch the glorious slow-motion train wreck when the repo men inevitably showed up to seize her wedding gifts. It would be a poetic, fitting punishment for her lifelong entitlement. But allowing the grift to succeed meant allowing Chase to eventually access the frozen funds. My $150,000 would evaporate into the Vegas underworld. Furthermore, my medical training dictates a strict adherence to a specific ethical code. You do not watch a patient walk toward a cliff and remain silent simply because they insulted you in the waiting room. I chose maximum accountability. I decided the truth required an audience. I could not simply send Savannah a private text message or call her on the phone. She would deny the evidence. She would accuse me of fabricating the documents out of bitter jealousy. Brenda would immediately close ranks, protecting the family optics and finding a way to excuse Chase's behavior. They would sweep the fraud under the rug to avoid the social embarrassment of a canceled engagement. If I wanted to detonate the illusion, I had to trigger the explosion in the exact social arena my mother used to smear my name. I had to deliver the proof in front of the very people she was trying to impress. I pulled my schedule from my pocket, checking the upcoming dates. The timing was flawless. This Saturday afternoon, Brenda was hosting Savannah's opulent bridal shower. The event was scheduled to take place at the Oakmont Country Club, the most exclusive high society venue in the Columbus suburbs. The guest list included 50 of the wealthiest women in the city, the exact demographic my parents sacrificed my future to appease. I packed my lunch bag and walked out of the break room, my mind operating with a cold, surgical precision. I did not need to hire a lawyer to execute this maneuver. I did not need a digital voice recorder or a police report. I only needed a printer and a heavy manila envelope. I spent the remainder of my shift visualizing the layout of the country club ballroom. How will Aurora crash the biggest social event of the season to deliver the ultimate blow and reduce the Harris family facade to ash? Saturday afternoon arrived, bringing a sharp, dry cold that settled over the Columbus suburbs. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, offering no warmth. I pulled my old sedan into the sprawling parking lot of the Oakmont Country Club. The asphalt was crowded with imported luxury SUVs and pristine black sedans. This was the fortress of the local elite, a place where membership required a six-figure initiation fee and a flawless social pedigree. It was the exact environment my mother worshipped, and the exact environment my father was currently defrauding to maintain his status. I did not wear a designer dress. I wore a simple black wool coat over dark slacks. I carried a heavy manila envelope tucked securely under my arm. Inside the envelope sat 20 pages of high-resolution printed documents. The bankruptcy filings, the shell company registrations, the aggressive creditor judgments against Chase Sterling, and a copy of the forged power of attorney Elias Thorne submitted to the federal authorities regarding Richard Harris. The paperwork was heavy, carrying the weight of total, absolute destruction. I walked up the sweeping stone steps to the main entrance. The heavy brass doors swung open, revealing a grand foyer adorned with marble floors and an enormous crystal chandelier. A young event coordinator stood behind a mahogany podium holding a leather-bound guest list. "Name, please," she asked, offering a polite, automated smile. "Charmaine Scott," I replied. "I am the sister of the bride." She scanned the list, running a manicured fingernail down the column of names. Her smile faltered slightly. "I am sorry," she said, her tone dropping an octave. "Your name is not on the approved entry list. The hostess specifically requested security handle any uninvited arrivals for the Rosewood Ballroom." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or demand to speak to a manager. I simply stepped around the podium, bypassing her entirely. "Ma'am, you cannot go in there," she called out, stepping out from behind the desk. I ignored her, walking with purposeful, measured strides down the carpeted hallway toward the double doors of the ballroom. I pushed the heavy doors open. The Rosewood Ballroom was a masterclass in excessive floral budgeting. Thousands of white orchids and pale pink peonies cascaded from the vaulted ceiling. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated backdrop to the overlapping chatter of 50 wealthy women. Waiters circulated through the room carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and miniature crab cakes. Savannah sat at the center of the room, positioned on an ornate velvet chair resembling a throne. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit, a delicate silk scarf draped around her neck. She was laughing, tossing her head back as she opened a silver-wrapped gift box. Brenda stood right beside her, holding a microphone, preparing to deliver a toast. The women surrounding them were the exact same society matrons who flooded my mother's Facebook page with vile comments. They were the aunts, the country club wives, and the church group leaders who called me a bitter spinster and suggested I be institutionalized. They sat at their tables, sipping stolen champagne, entirely oblivious to the criminal rot financing their afternoon entertainment. The heavy doors swinging shut behind me echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. A woman sitting near the entrance turned her head. She gasped a sharp, audible sound of surprise. The reaction rippled across the ballroom. One by one, the women stopped talking. The clinking of silverware ceased. The string quartet, noticing the sudden shift in the room's energy, awkwardly lowered their bows, trailing off into an uncomfortable silence. The room fell dead silent. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto me. Brenda lowered the microphone. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to stiffen. The color drained from her cheeks, replaced by a harsh, furious red flush. She recognized the threat immediately. "What are you doing here?" Brenda demanded, her voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. "You are not welcome here, Aurora. You are unstable." She turned toward the doorway, frantically signaling to a waiter. "Call security right now. Have her removed from the premises." I did not stop walking. I crossed the ballroom floor, the soft click of my boots echoing against the hardwood. The society women parted instinctively, creating a clear path directly to the velvet throne. The dramatic irony of the moment was intoxicating. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and judgment, believing the false narrative my mother spun. They thought they were witnessing a jealous sibling throwing a public tantrum. They were actually witnessing an execution. I stopped 3 feet away from Savannah. My sister stared up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and lingering arrogance. "You need to leave," Savannah hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid making a scene. "You are embarrassing yourself. Chase is going to press charges if you keep harassing us." I did not respond to the insult. I reached under my arm and pulled the thick manila envelope forward. I held it out, offering it to her. "I brought you a wedding gift," I announced. My voice was clear, steady, and projected loud enough for the front row of tables to hear every single syllable. Savannah looked at the envelope. Her greed momentarily overrode her anger. She assumed it was a concession, a peace offering, designed to repair the damage. She snatched the envelope from my hand, ripping the paper flap open with manicured nails. Instead of a cashier's check, she pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. I stood perfectly still, watching the cognitive dissonance strike her system. The arrogant smirk vanished. Her eyes scanned the bold black text on the top page. It was a formal civil judgment against Chase Sterling, filed by a predatory lending syndicate out of Miami. She flipped to the second page, revealing the bankruptcy filings. She flipped to the third page, exposing the corporate registration, linking her luxury wedding planner to the exact same aggressive bookies. The silence in the ballroom grew heavy, suffocating, and electric. The society women leaned forward in their chairs, straining to see the documents. Frantic whispers began to ripple through the crowd like wind rustling through dry leaves. "What is this?" Savannah whispered, her voice trembling, her hands shook, causing the thick paper to rattle loudly. "It is the Sterling family dynasty," I replied, delivering the fatal blow. "Your wealthy finance prodigy is a failed crypto trader drowning in $200,000 of gambling debt. He does not manage offshore hedge funds. He manages aggressive collection agents." Brenda lunged forward, her face contorted in sheer panic. She attempted to snatch the documents from Savannah's trembling hands. "Give me those!" she shrieked, dropping the refined matriarch persona entirely. "They are fake. She is a liar. She fabricated these to ruin your day." I took a half step back, avoiding her grasping hands. "Flip to the final page, Savannah," I instructed, ignoring my mother's frantic screaming. "Look at the federal subpoena Elias Thorne filed this morning." Savannah ignored her mother. She turned to the back of the stack. She stared at the high-resolution photocopy of the forged power of attorney bearing our grandfather's signature. She read the attached legal summary detailing the cross-collateralized commercial loans and the impending foreclosure on the Harris family mansion. The illusion shattered instantly, publicly and permanently. The pristine ivory pantsuit suddenly looked absurd. The cascading white orchids surrounding her throne appeared like funeral arrangements. The wealthy society women, the country club wives, who built their entire identities on the perception of flawless success, watched as the Harris family facade disintegrated into ash. They whispered, covering their mouths with their hands, the brutal truth spreading through the room faster than a virus. Savannah dropped the papers, the documents scattered across the hardwood floor, right at Brenda's feet. My sister looked at the scattered evidence and then looked at the 50 guests staring back at her. The sheer, crushing weight of the public humiliation short-circuited her nervous system. She let out a sharp, gasping sob, clutching her chest. Her knees buckled and she collapsed, sinking down into the velvet chair, burying her face in her hands. Brenda dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the papers, desperately trying to hide the truth from the prying eyes of her peers. It was a pathetic, futile gesture. The damage was absolute. I turned around and walked back down the center aisle. I did not look back at the sobbing bride or the frantic mother. I pushed through the heavy double doors, leaving the opulent ballroom behind. I walked out of the country club, breathing in the sharp, cold Ohio air. The money was gone. The facade was shattered. The arrogant patriarch, the complicit matriarch, and the golden child were finally forced to live in reality. With the wedding destroyed and the federal authorities circling, how will the toxic family turn on each other when the walls finally cave in? The fallout from the Oakmont Country Club radiated through the Columbus suburbs with the speed of a wind-blown wildfire. The society matrons who witnessed the destruction of the Sterling dynasty wasted no time disseminating the scandal. By Monday morning, the country club group chats and church prayer circles were saturated with rumors. Savannah acted swiftly, attempting to salvage a fraction of her dignity. She canceled the Winter Wonderland wedding via a brief, sterile text message sent to the bridal party. She blocked Chase Sterling on every digital platform. The disgraced crypto trader did not even attempt to contact her. He packed his leased apartment in the dead of night and fled the state, running from the predatory lending syndicate he failed to pay. However, canceling a wedding does not magically erase the financial wreckage left in its wake. The fake luxury event planner operated by Chase's aggressive bookies invoked a rigid cancellation clause buried deep within their fraudulent contract. They claimed the initial deposits were non-refundable. Even though Elias Thorne had legally paralyzed the $150,000 with a federal injunction, the money remained trapped in a procedural purgatory. The funds sat locked in a contested escrow account, inaccessible to both the fleeing groom and my ruined family. The caterers, the florists, and the venue managers, left holding empty promises, began bombarding my father's phone, demanding immediate payment for their wasted inventory. Richard ignored their calls. He had a much larger catastrophe barreling toward his front door. On Tuesday afternoon, a private process server pulled into the circular driveway of the Harris mansion. The courier bypassed the decorative winter wreaths framing the heavy oak doors and rang the bell. Richard answered, expecting a delivery of imported wine he ordered weeks prior. Instead, the server handed him a thick manila folder bearing the official seal of the state banking authority. It was the formal notice of default and impending foreclosure. Grandpa Harrison's legal strike had landed with devastating accuracy. The cross-collateralized commercial loans Richard secured using the forged power of attorney were officially declared delinquent. The bank auditors, recognizing the severe criminal liability hovering over the portfolio, severed all ties with the Harris name. The financial institution activated an accelerated acceleration clause, demanding the immediate repayment of the entire loan balance. Richard possessed 30 days to cure the default, or the bank would seize the 10,000-square-foot suburban fortress, auction it to the highest bidder, and leave my parents homeless. The illusion of the upper-class dynasty evaporated, leaving behind a freezing, half-empty house. The utility companies, noticing the bounced automated payments, shut off the central heating. A bitter chill seeped through the grand bay windows, settling over the imported marble floors. Panic is a highly corrosive acid. It strips away the polite veneer of civilization and exposes the raw, desperate survival instincts hiding underneath. Cornered and stripped of his credit lines, Richard turned his frantic gaze toward the only remaining source of liquid capital in the house. He turned on his golden child. Savannah sat on the edge of a custom-upholstered sofa in the living room, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. Her eyes were red and swollen from 3 days of uninterrupted crying. She stared blankly at the unlit fireplace, mourning the death of her high society future. Richard paced the length of the Persian rug, clutching the foreclosure notice in his trembling hand. He stopped in front of his favorite daughter. His eyes darted down to her left hand. The engagement ring, a 3-carat emerald-cut diamond set in platinum, still rested on her finger. Chase was a fraud, but the diamond itself was a genuine asset, purchased on a maxed-out credit card before his financial collapse. "Take it off," Richard demanded, his voice tight and ragged. Savannah blinked, looking up at him in confusion. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I said take the ring off," Savannah Richard repeated, stepping closer. He extended his open palm. "We are losing the house. The bank is going to lock the doors in 4 weeks. That diamond appraises for at least $40,000 on the secondary market. I have a contact in the diamond district who pays cash, quietly. Hand it over." Savannah pulled her hand back, clutching it against her chest. "You cannot sell my ring," she protested, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her cheeks. "It is the only thing I have left. It is mine." "Nothing in this house is yours," Richard snapped, the remaining shreds of his paternal warmth vanishing entirely. "You have never paid for a single item you own. You dropped out of 3 universities. You live in my pool house. I need that ring. Furthermore, go upstairs and pack the designer handbags, the imported shoes, and the vintage watches I bought you over the last 5 years. We are taking them to a luxury consignment broker tomorrow morning. We need cash to hire a defense attorney before the federal prosecutors knock on this door." Brenda walked into the living room clutching a mug of hot tea. She wore an old bathrobe, her perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess. Savannah looked toward her mother, expecting a defender, expecting the woman who always shielded her from consequence to intervene. "Listen to your father, Savannah," Brenda said, her tone flat and devoid of sympathy. "We are about to be on the street. You need to do your part. We bought those things to make you look like a proper Sterling. There is no Sterling wedding anymore. The props are useless. Give him the jewelry." The words hung in the freezing air of the living room. The transaction was laid bare. Savannah stared at the 2 people who raised her. The realization hit her with the crushing force of a falling anvil. The coddling, the luxury cars, the endless financial bailouts they were, never expressions of unconditional parental love. They were investments. Richard and Brenda treated her like a prized racehorse, grooming her to secure a wealthy bloodline that would elevate their own social standing. Now that the race was lost and the horse failed to deliver the prize, they were ready to send her to the slaughterhouse to pay their debts. She realized she was only valued when she served their vanity. A profound coldness washed over Savannah. The tears stopped. The naive, spoiled princess died in that freezing living room, replaced by a hardened, cynical survivor. She stood up, pulling the wool blanket tight around her shoulders. "No," she said. Richard bristled, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Excuse me," he growled. "You bought these things to boost your own ego," Savannah replied, her voice eerily calm. "You forged Grandpa's signature. You stole Aurora's savings. You built this disaster. I am not selling my belongings to bail you out of a federal crime. You are on your own." Savannah turned her back on them and walked up the sweeping grand staircase. She spent the next hour packing 3 large Louis Vuitton suitcases with every valuable item she possessed. She called a ride-sharing service. She walked out the front door, ignoring her father's furious shouting and her mother's desperate pleading. The tires of the hired car crunched over the icy driveway, carrying the golden child away. She abandoned her parents in the sprawling, freezing mansion, leaving them to face the incoming storm alone. The toxic family dynamic had finally eaten itself alive. Later that evening, I sat in my warm, comfortable apartment reviewing a pediatric chart on my laptop. A cup of hot green tea rested next to my keyboard. The silence of the evening was broken by the ringing of my cellular phone. The screen displayed my father's name. I almost ignored it. The urge to block the number and erase him from my existence was strong. But true closure requires hearing the final note of the symphony. I tapped the screen and accepted the call. I did not say a word. I let him speak first. Aurora Richard whispered. He was weeping. The sound was pathetic, a wet, ragged sobbing that echoed through the phone speaker. The arrogant patriarch who stood on the porch and laughed at my pain was dead. The predator who threatened my nursing license in the coffee shop was gone. He was stripped of his money, his status, his favorite daughter, and his pride. Please, he begged, his voice cracking. Please help us. Savannah left. The heat is shut off. The bank sent the default notice today. We have nowhere to go, Aurora. We are going to be homeless. He drew a shaky breath, struggling to form the words. You are his favorite now, he pleaded. Call Harrison. Call your grandfather and tell him to drop the foreclosure. Tell him we surrender. I will do whatever he wants. Just do not let them take the house. You have the power to stop this. Please save us. The role reversal was absolute. The man who stole my future was now kneeling in the dark, begging me to secure his. He expected the empathetic nurse, the quiet daughter who always kept the peace, to throw him a lifeline. He forgot that the daughter he raised died the moment she saw the $12 balance on her banking app. I listened to his weeping for a long moment, memorizing the sound of his defeat. I cannot call off the bank, Richard, I said, my voice cool, detached, and unyielding. The foreclosure is a consequence of your forged signatures. I do not control the commercial lenders. I paused, letting the reality of his situation settle over him. There is only one way you avoid spending the rest of your life in a concrete cell, I continued. Elias Thorne prepared the final settlement documents. He expects you in Cleveland tomorrow. Will Richard finally face the legal consequences of his actions under oath? The drive to Cleveland the following morning felt different. The tension that gripped my shoulders during the previous trips up Interstate 71 was gone. The storm was over. The sky above Lake Erie was a clear, brittle gray. I parked near the high-rise that housed the law offices of Elias Thorne and took the elevator to the 20th floor. I was not walking into a negotiation. I was walking into a surrender. The conference room was prepped for a formal deposition. The heavy mahogany table was cleared of the chaotic stacks of manila folders. A digital stenography machine sat in the center of the table, operated by a quiet court reporter. A small black camera was mounted in the corner, capturing the official visual record of the proceedings. My grandfather Harrison was present in the room this time. He sat at the far end of the table, wearing a dark tailored suit, his hands resting calmly on the polished wood. He looked formidable. A man who had weathered decades of corporate warfare and survived. He nodded to me as I took the seat next to Elias Thorne. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door clicked open. Richard walked in. He looked like a ghost. His skin carried a sickly pallor, and deep, dark circles bruised the delicate skin under his eyes. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, suggesting he had lost a significant amount of weight over the last 2 weeks. The arrogant swagger, the expansive posture he displayed on the back porch Thanksgiving night was entirely eradicated. He shuffled toward the empty chair on the opposite side of the table, looking down at his hands, avoiding eye contact with both me and his father. His legal counsel, a weary-looking defense attorney hired on a rapidly depleting retainer, sat down beside him. The lawyer looked at Elias Thorne and offered a grim nod of concession. They possessed zero leverage. They were here to beg for mercy. The court reporter instructed Richard to raise his right hand. She swore him in under the penalty of perjury. The deposition officially commenced. Elias Thorne did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout or pound his fist on the table. He operated with the cold, methodical precision of a surgeon dissecting a tumor. He opened a single, sleek black folder and began laying out the paper trail, piece by piece. He presented the forged power of attorney. He presented the cross-collateralized commercial loans. He presented the digital wire transfer authorization, draining my legacy account. Richard answered the questions in a low, hoarse whisper. Yes, that is my signature. Yes, I authorized the transfer. Yes, I forged the notary seal. Each admission stripped away another layer of his fabricated identity. The towering legend of the self-made Columbus businessman chipped away, leaving behind nothing but a frightened, desperate thief. Then Elias turned the page in his folder, shifting the focus away from the mechanics of the crime and toward the psychology of the theft. The attorney wanted the motive entered into the official record. Mr. Harris Elias began leaning forward slightly. You possessed a sprawling estate. You held active memberships at several elite social clubs. You owned valuable assets. Yet when your fraudulent credit lines collapsed, you chose to bypass liquidating your own personal property. Instead, you specifically targeted the custodial savings account belonging to your eldest daughter, a daughter who works in public health care. Why? Why did you feel entitled to confiscate funds generated entirely by her labor? Richard shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. The flush of humiliation crawled up his neck, staining his pale skin a mottled red. He looked at his defense attorney, hoping for an objection to halt the line of questioning. The lawyer remained silent, recognizing the motive was central to the civil suit. Richard looked back at Elias, his jaw tightening. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. I needed the cash immediately, he stammered, his voice defensive. The wedding planner demanded a wire transfer. Selling a car or a watch takes time. The UTMA account was liquid. It was sitting right there. That explains the logistics. Elias countered his gaze unblinking. It does not explain the moral justification. You knew the $150,000 was earmarked for her home purchase. You knew she worked night shifts for 7 years to save that money. Why did you choose to sacrifice her future to save your own? The silence in the room became agonizing. The court reporter waited, her fingers hovering over the keys. Harrison watched his son in his icy blue eyes, conveying a profound, unyielding disappointment. I sat perfectly still, watching the man who raised me struggle to articulate the darkness inside his own soul. Richard slumped forward, resting his elbows on the table. He buried his face in his hands, hiding from the camera, hiding from his father, hiding from me. A quiet, wretched sob tore from his throat. The last remaining shred of his pride disintegrated into dust. He looked up, tears spilling over his eyelashes, and offered the ugly, unvarnished truth. I took it from Aurora because I knew she would survive, he confessed, weeping into the microphone. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. I panicked, Richard continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his own cowardice. The bank sent the first warning letter regarding the commercial audits. I knew the foreclosure was coming. I knew the money was gone. Brenda and Savannah, they do not know how to live without the credit cards. They do not know how to struggle. If I told them we were broke, if I canceled the wedding and sold the cars, they would have left me. They loved the lifestyle, not me. He looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, twisted sincerity. He honestly believed his logic exonerated him. You are different, Aurora, he said. You are strong. You always have been. You built your own life. You survived nursing school. You survived those horrible hospital shifts. I knew that if I took your money, you would be angry, but you would figure it out. You would rebuild. You possess the grit to survive being broke. Savannah would shatter. I sacrificed you because you were the only one strong enough to carry the burden. I used your resilience to keep my family together. A profound, clarifying silence settled over the room. I stared at my father, processing the staggering dysfunction of his confession. He did not steal from me because he hated me. He stole from me because he relied on my strength. He viewed my independence and my work ethic not as traits to be celebrated, but as renewable resources he could harvest to protect his own fragile ego. He expected me to absorb the trauma, the theft, and the betrayal simply because I was capable of surviving the pain. He weaponized my resilience to shield his own cowardice. The last remaining thread of familial obligation tying me to this man snapped right then and there. The anger that fueled me for the past month evaporated, leaving behind a vast Arctic emptiness. I looked at the sobbing, broken man sitting across the table, and I felt nothing. No pity, no sadness, only a cold, absolute indifference. He was a stranger. I turned to Elias Thorne. "Finish it," I instructed. Elias nodded. He slid a final thick stack of documents across the mahogany table toward Richard's defense attorney. It was the Master Settlement Agreement. The terms were brutal, uncompromising, and legally binding. In exchange for Harrison dropping the federal fraud complaint regarding the forged power of attorney, Richard was required to surrender everything. He agreed to relinquish all claims to the Harris family trust, permanently disinheriting himself. He agreed to an immediate, uncontested bank auction of the Columbus mansion to satisfy the commercial debts. Finally, he signed a confession of judgment, acknowledging the civil theft of my $150,000, allowing Elias to legally claw back the frozen funds from the fake wedding planner's escrow account without enduring a lengthy trial. Richard picked up the pen. His hand shook violently, but he signed his name on the dotted line. He traded his empire for his freedom. The legal victory was secured. The documents were notarized. The deposition ended. I walked out of the high-rise, stepping into the crisp Cleveland air. The legal machinery operated with cold efficiency, untangling the mess my father created. But the emotional climax, the true poetic resolution of this nightmare, awaited its final execution. What happens on the exact day the Winter Wonderland wedding was supposed to take place? The second Saturday of January arrived carrying a bitter, biting frost. This specific date was engraved on 300 heavy cardstock invitations trimmed in silver foil. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my parents' social climbing career, a Winter Wonderland spectacle designed to cement their legacy among the suburban elite. Instead, the morning dawned cold and unforgiving, turning the manicured lawns of Columbus into frozen, brittle wastelands. I woke up in my quiet apartment brewing a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. I did not request the day off from the hospital, but my schedule naturally afforded me a free weekend. I sat near the window watching the weak sunlight hit the frost on the glass. I felt a profound sense of peace. There was no lingering anger or residual sorrow. The emotional ties were severed during the deposition in Cleveland. Now I was merely a spectator, watching gravity claim a structure built on rotting pillars. I did not drive across town to witness the physical destruction of their estate. Gloating is a symptom of insecurity, and I no longer needed their validation. However, avoiding the wreckage was impossible. The neighborhood group messages and the local news blogs provided a continuous stream of visual evidence. At 9 in the morning, a fleet of commercial transport vehicles lined the sweeping circular driveway of the Harris mansion. The logistics of their ruin were playing out in broad daylight. The vendors who originally contracted for the luxury reception realized the fraudulent nature of the event planning shell company. When Elias Thorne paralyzed the escrow ledger, the legitimate subcontractors recognized they would never see their promised wages. Since my father signed the master service agreements using his own name before his credit lines froze, the creditors sought direct restitution. They arrived with court-ordered collection mandates to reclaim their losses. Men wearing heavy canvas work jackets marched through the grand oak doors. They carried out the velvet sofas, the imported mahogany dining tables, and the glittering crystal chandeliers. Everything my parents purchased on credit to project an aristocratic aura was systematically stripped away. Heavy tow trucks backed up to the pristine heated garages, hooking thick steel chains to the bumpers of the least luxury sedans. The metallic clanking echoed through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, providing a harsh soundtrack to their financial demise. Brenda stood on the icy sidewalk, shivering in the winter wind. She wore a plain wool coat, her designer cashmere packed away or seized by the liquidators. Her perfectly styled hair hung limp around her face. She watched an agent representing the commercial lending institution march up the front steps. The agent held a heavy steel lockbox. The loud, sharp click of the device snapping over the brass door handle signaled the official termination of her reign. The sprawling suburban fortress was no longer hers. It belonged to the bank. High society operates with a ruthless, terrifying efficiency. The exact same women who flooded my inbox with venomous insults weeks prior now directed their predatory focus toward my mother. Vehicles rolled slowly past the foreclosed property. Tinted windows rolled down, allowing smartphones to capture the humiliation. The tennis leagues and the country club dining rooms feasted on the spectacular collapse. The Harris name transformed from a coveted status symbol into a cautionary tale of debt and delusion. They were exiled, permanently banished from the only circle they valued. Across the city, my younger sister experienced her own agonizing reckoning. Savannah did not wake up inside a penthouse bridal suite, sipping imported champagne while makeup artists hovered nearby. She woke up alone, on a sunken mattress, inside a budget motel located off a noisy interstate highway. Peeling floral wallpaper and the distinct smell of stale cigarette smoke replaced the orchids and the string quartets. The reality of her situation offered no comfort. Her finance prodigy was a phantom. Chase fled the state weeks ago, disappearing into the shadows to evade the unregulated lending syndicate hunting him down. He left no forwarding address, no explanation, and no apology. He was a parasite searching for a new host. Savannah stared at her cellular phone, reading the neighborhood gossip forums. She scrolled through the photographs of her childhood home being emptied by repo agents. The illusion she defended in the hospital cafeteria was entirely erased. She realized she possessed no marketable skills, no college degree, and no wealthy savior to bail her out. Richard remained unseen during the property seizure. He likely hid inside a rented room or a cheap extended stay facility, avoiding the stares of his former peers. He traded his sprawling empire for the stark reality of survival, relying on whatever meager funds the bankruptcy courts allowed him to keep. The arrogant patriarch who laughed at my pain on Thanksgiving night was reduced to a ghost, haunting the edges of a city he once claimed to conquer. The afternoon ticked by. The winter sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across my living room floor. I finished my coffee and opened a textbook studying for an upcoming pediatric certification exam. I refused to let their tragedy consume my day. Then my phone chimed, resting on the small wooden table. A secure, encrypted notification from the law offices of Elias Thorne illuminated the screen. The text was brief and highly clinical. The settlement parameters are fully executed. The disputed funds were successfully retrieved from the paralyzed escrow ledger. The transfer is finalized. Check your balance. I picked up the device and tapped the blue icon of my banking application. The software loaded, bringing up the familiar interface. A small circle spun for a fraction of a second. I remembered the suffocating terror I felt on Thanksgiving when the screen displayed $12.50. I remembered the cold wind on the porch and the mocking laughter of my father. The numbers populated the screen. The meager balance vanished. $150,000 sat securely within the ledger. The safety net was restored. But the sum did not end there. A substantial secondary deposit sat right beneath the primary amount. It covered the legal penalty fees, the accrued interest, and the punitive damages outlined in the settlement agreement signed during the deposition. My father paid a premium for his theft. I locked the phone and set it down. The war was officially over. I did not shed a tear of joy, nor did I celebrate with a grand gesture. I simply exhaled, letting the remaining tension leave my body. The perpetrators dismantled their own lives through sheer arrogance and greed. The ruin was total, logical, and entirely of their own making. I possessed my independence, my career, and my restored future. The passage of time offers perspective. Healing requires distance and a steadfast commitment to moving forward. Yet, closing a chapter sometimes demands a final physical act of reclamation. 1 year later, what is the ultimate poetic revenge Aurora enacts to seal the vault on her past and cement her own towering legacy? 14 months passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the Cleveland law office clicked shut, ending the legal war. The brutal Ohio winter finally surrendered, yielding to a vibrant, humid spring. The thick layers of gray ice melted away, washing the salt and dirty slush from the suburban streets. Green shoots pushed through the thawing soil, breaking the hard earth to reach the warming sun. The seasonal shift mirrored the internal transformation taking place within my own chest. The freezing, suffocating tension of the past decade dissolved, leaving behind a rich, fertile landscape ready for new growth. I no longer braced myself for sudden phone calls or navigated the exhausting emotional minefields of my childhood. I stood on the sweeping wraparound porch of the Columbus estate, resting my hands against the smooth cedar railing. The morning air smelled of damp earth and blooming dogwood trees. I traced the grain of the wood, remembering the bitter Thanksgiving night when I stood on this exact spot, clutching my phone and staring down my father. The context of my presence, however, possessed a profoundly different reality. I was not visiting my parents. I was not an unwelcome guest or a scapegoat summoned to absorb their anxiety. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key ring. The jagged metal keys chimed softly in the quiet morning air. I owned the estate. When the commercial lenders seized the property, the 10,000-square-foot fortress sat empty for several months. Banks despise holding vacant real estate. They listed the property at a public foreclosure auction, eager to erase the delinquent asset from their corporate ledgers. The starting bids reflected a fraction of the original appraised value. I did not require a predatory mortgage to enter the bidding war. I combined my recovered savings with a generous early inheritance gift provided by my grandfather. Harrison transferred the capital with a handwritten note instructing me to buy the dirt they tried to bury me in. I purchased the deed for pennies on the dollar, securing the transaction with cold, hard cash. A heavy diesel truck rumbled up the circular driveway, interrupting the quiet symphony of the morning songbirds. The vehicle parked near the front steps, displaying the logo of a premier local remodeling firm. A man wearing a canvas work jacket stepped out of the cab, carrying a thick clipboard and a rolled blueprint. It was the exact same contractor who sent me the $10,000 invoice on Thanksgiving night. The invoice, intended for a modest downtown condo, was now redirected toward a much larger canvas. I shook his hand and walked him through the grand double doors, stepping into the cavernous, empty foyer. We bypassed the imported marble living room and headed straight up the sweeping staircase toward the second floor. My parents previously renovated the entire east wing, creating an extravagant $50,000 custom bridal suite for Savannah. The space featured a raised dressing platform, mirrored vanity stations, and silk-padded walls designed to accommodate a team of hair and makeup artists. It was a monument to vanity and unearned privilege. "Tear it all out," I instructed the contractor, sweeping my hand across the room. "Remove the mirrors. Rip out the platform. I want hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and a large bay window overlooking the back garden." We finalized the blueprints, transforming the shrine of the Golden Child into a functional, serene home office. I planned to use the space to study for my advanced pediatric nurse practitioner exams. The destruction of the bridal suite was not an act of petty vengeance. It was a physical manifestation of reclaiming my stolen territory and repurposing it for educational growth. The people who previously occupied these halls adapted to a vastly different reality. The legal settlement stripped Richard of his hidden empire, leaving him entirely exposed to the unyielding forces of the working class. He and Brenda currently lease a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a noisy industrial sector of the city. The sprawling, manicured lawns were replaced by a view of a concrete retaining wall and a busy highway overpass. Cut off from the family wealth and shunned by the country club elite, my father secured employment as a retail associate at a big box hardware store. He spends his days wearing a bright orange vest, directing customers to the plumbing aisle and sweeping the concrete floors before closing. The physical toll of the labor shows in his weary posture and his calloused hands. Brenda found work managing the fragrance counter at a mid-tier department store. She forces polite smiles for passing shoppers while standing on her feet for 8 hours a day. The luxurious facade they sacrificed my future to maintain evaporated, forcing them to earn their living through the exact mundane labor they once mocked. Savannah faced her own harsh collision with the real world. Abandoned by her fraudulent fiancé and exiled from her opulent lifestyle, she scrambled to find stability. She works as a receptionist at a busy suburban dental clinic. She answers ringing phones, schedules root canals, and files insurance claims under the harsh glare of fluorescent office lights. There are no offshore hedge funds arriving to rescue her. She deals with frustrated patients and strict lunch breaks, learning the grueling, unforgiving math of a bi-weekly paycheck. I walked back downstairs, entering the expansive kitchen. The granite island, where I discovered the $12 banking balance, remained cool to the touch. I plugged in a coffee maker and brewed a fresh pot, pouring the steaming dark liquid into a ceramic mug. The rich aroma filled the empty room, erasing the lingering ghosts of the past. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a familiar Cleveland area code. The line connected after 2 rings. "Good morning, Kid Harrison," said his gruff voice, radiating a deep, genuine warmth. "How is the new property?" "The demolition starts today, Grandpa," I replied, taking a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee. "The contractor is already tearing down the east wing. It feels good. It feels like home." Harrison let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Make sure they use solid oak for those bookshelves," he advised. "You are going to need the structural support for all your medical textbooks." "I am proud of you, Aurora." "Thank you," I whispered the words, carrying a profound weight. "I love you." I hung up the phone and walked over to the bay windows, looking out over the sprawling backyard. The sunlight caught the morning dew sparkling across the green grass. The journey through the fire demanded a heavy toll, but the resulting clarity proved invaluable. Setting ironclad boundaries and demanding strict accountability from the people who share your bloodline is often painted as a cruel act. Society pressures the victim to keep the peace, to swallow the betrayal, and to forgive without requiring repentance. I learned the hard way that silence is merely permission for further abuse. Protecting your resources, your sanity, and your future is not an act of spite. It is the ultimate expression of self-preservation. I raised my mug to the empty room, to the melted snow, and to the beautiful, quiet life I built with my own 2 hands. The screen fades to black. We often look at the American suburban landscape through a lens of accumulated milestones. The manicured green lawns, the gleaming luxury sedans parked in the driveways, the glossy holiday greeting cards depicting flawless smiles. In our culture, success is frequently measured by tangible, outward achievements. The university degrees framed on the wall, the promotions, the zip codes, and the opulent weddings that serve as crowning societal achievements. But beneath the polished hardwood floors and the vaulted ceilings of these beautiful homes, a quiet spiritual crisis is unfolding. Aurora's journey from a betrayed daughter standing in the freezing snow to the owner of the very estate that sought to ruin her is not merely a tale of financial theft. It is a profound modern parable. It holds a mirror up to the illusions of the ego, the destructive nature of social attachment, and the steep moral cost of misguided parental love. When we examine the current state of our society, a culture that heavily equates personal worth with material wealth, we see parents buckling under an unnatural pressure. In the desperate rush to secure a pristine legacy for their children, many lose their moral center. They forget what it means to be a guide. Richard and Brenda chased the illusion of elite status so blindly, they willingly sacrificed their own flesh and blood to maintain a rotting facade. They smiled for the country club photographs while drowning in hidden debt, treating their family like a corporate merger rather than a sanctuary of unconditional support. As a society, we must recognize the danger of the facade. When parents build a family foundation on pride and deception simply to avoid looking like a failure to their neighbors, that foundation will inevitably collapse from the inside out. True wealth is a peaceful conscience. We must teach our children that there is no shame in honest struggle. There is, however, a deep spiritual poverty in living a lie. This story also forces us to examine the perilous dynamic of enabling. Brenda and Richard poured endless resources into Savannah, shielding her from every consequence and paving every road she walked. Today, we often refer to this as snowplow parenting, but in psychological terms, it is an interference with the soul's natural cause and effect. When parents constantly remove obstacles, pay off debts, and protect their chosen golden children from the harsh realities of the world, they inadvertently cripple the child's spirit. You do not create a strong, capable adult by handing them a platinum credit card and a fabricated reality. You create a fragile, entitled ego that will shatter at the first sign of real-world adversity. Savannah was left stranded in a cheap motel answering phones at a dental clinic because her parents denied her the necessary curriculum of struggle. True parental love sometimes requires us to step back and allow our children to fall so they can learn the sacred art of getting back up on their own. This leads us to the darkest, unspoken dynamic hidden in many traditional homes, laid bare by Richard's tearful confession in the deposition room. He admitted he stole from Aurora because he knew she possessed the grit to survive the ruin. He weaponized his own daughter's resilience. Parents often rely heavily on their strongest, most independent child to absorb the family's trauma while endlessly coddling the fragile one. Spiritual wisdom and true family responsibility demand emotional equity. A child's resilience is a gift meant to fuel their own life journey. It is not an endless battery for parents to drain in order to keep a dysfunctional family system running. Fairness in raising children means looking inward and healing our own anxieties, rather than expecting the strongest child to set themselves on fire just to keep the rest of the household warm. Unhealed trauma and unmanaged ego are passed down like a dark inheritance. If parents do not do the difficult, quiet inner work to face their own insecurities, they will inevitably project those exact fears onto their children. Richard was terrified of losing his status. Brenda was terrified of losing her social circle. They let their fear dictate their morality. Awakening begins the very moment a parent looks in the mirror and decides that they will not let their own insecurities compromise their integrity. These are the quiet battles fought in living rooms and kitchens across the country every single day. The choices we make when no one is watching dictate the legacy we leave behind. If you find value in these reflections, and if navigating the messy, beautiful, and sometimes painful reality of human relationships resonates with your own journey, please take a moment to follow our channel, Sister Revenge. We explore the deep truths hidden in everyday lives, and we would love to have you walk this path of understanding with us. American culture often dictates that a parent's ultimate goal is to leave behind a financial empire or a paid-off estate. We measure our parenting success by the trust funds we establish and the properties we pass down to the next generation. But what is a sprawling mansion worth if it costs you your child's trust? What is a grand wedding worth if it is built on the silent theft of another person's peace? Let go of the desperate need to engineer your children's financial and social triumphs. Focus instead on the inner landscape of your home. Cultivate an environment where honesty is valued above appearances, where accountability is practiced with deep compassion, and where love is given freely rather than earned through compliance. If you raise children with a strong moral compass, deep emotional awareness, and the courage to live truthfully, you have given them an inheritance that no economic downturn, no bank foreclosure, and no human failing can ever wash away. Look closely at the walls of your own home. Listen to the quiet conversations happening across your dinner table. Pay attention to the subtle dynamics forming between your children. Ask yourself what kind of foundation you are truly pouring today, because when the storms of life inevitably roll in and the freezing winds howl against the glass, the illusions will wash away. You are left to wonder when the sky finally clears and the morning sun rises. Will your family be left standing together on solid ground, or will you find yourself standing alone in an empty house, listening to the echoes of the choices you made?